It's Monday, October 3rd, and since we invented weather satellites, a hurricane has never killed this many people in Florida. We start here. As water levels go down, the death toll is quickly rising.
It really spoke to me that there was such a broad area that they needed to get to.
So what made Hurricane Ian so much deadlier than its predecessors? There's no time for rookie jitters when you're a Supreme Court justice.
She will have an impact on this court in ways that I don't think we'll even begin to see until the next 5-10 years from now.
Ketanji Brown Jackson hears her first case as a justice today. So what cases will cement this term's legacy? And the first tackle was scary. The second could change NFL policy overnight.
What the NFL's not telling you is that protocol is not strong.
Why was an NFL quarterback allowed to play just a few days after stumbling off the field? From ABC News, this is Start Here. I'm Brad Milkey. If you look at a list of the deadliest hurricanes in American history, there are lots of storms in this country that have killed hundreds of people at a time. The thing is, besides Katrina in Louisiana and Maria in Puerto Rico, all the other storms with huge death tolls happened more than 50 years ago. Like, to be frank, not that many Americans die in hurricanes anymore, mainly because of structural improvements and better advanced warnings, which is what was so worrying about Hurricane Ian last week. As it made its final turn towards the southwest coast of Florida, it was heading towards residents who just days earlier had heard this thing wasn't going to hit them.
Now I've lost everything. Everything, my life savings, everything, my tools, everything.
Over the weekend, as floodwaters receded, that death toll started to climb. Let's start the day with ABC's chief meteorologist, Ginger Z, who is right there in the thick of it. Ginger, what do we know about the death toll at this point, and is it going to get even worse from here?
We know that the death toll is hovering around 80. We know that that will climb. Unfortunately, there are areas they still have not reached, still haven't checked.
You're okay. You stay right there, bud.
They've had to be getting medical help and supplies to people on islands. I spent time in one neighborhood, the Siesta Bay RV Park.
Kind of woke up to find myself floating about an arm away from my roof. So I climbed out of the house and climbed up on the roof and was there for 5.5 hours.
900 homes, mostly elderly people, with not many means. And when we were there, it had been more than 24 hours since the storm. And none of those houses had an X on them. That X that we see after every storm, usually within the first couple of days, that tells us this home has been checked to know, okay, somebody came here. It's usually spray painted in a fluorescent color. I didn't see those in that first 30 hours or so.
The size and the scope of this thing just requires a lot of manpower, a lot of time to get to some of the farther outreached areas. Not to mention that we're still in rescue mode. Many communities are still surrounded by floodwater.
It really spoke to me that there was such a broad area that they needed to get to.
Is there anybody in there?
Those islands of Sanibel and Captiva, Pine Island, you had flooding, like severe surge from Naples all the way through that heavily populated Fort Myers.
Right now, it's getting everybody off that island into safety. It is not habitable.
When we couldn't get the door open, I think we both came to terms with we're going to die in this house.
To say that, an area that didn't think they'd be hit, absolutely true that the track was not as close to them early on in the week. What was close to them was the storm surge warning. And on Monday, they had a 4 to 8 foot surge. Late in the day into early Tuesday, that went 8 to 12. When it goes 8 to 12 and you live at a beach right at a coast, now you're in the area where you could see flooding for miles inland. And this is a place where I think our science needs a lot of work to communicate that, because you don't have to be right next to the track of a storm to see the most huge impacts.
And Ginger, that's what I was going to ask you, because commonly in our politics coverage or in, anti-terrorism coverage, we talk about how Americans now trust institutions less. Like that's a thing. It sounds very theoretical in the moment, but part of me wonders if there were people who heard these forecasts and the shifting forecasts and the shifting models and said, I don't trust this information. I'm going to stay. Like, is this loss of life perhaps going to owe itself to people not trusting institutional information?
Partly, I think yes.
I look at it and I say, wow, this really happened. And I'm such a jerk. I should have gotten out of here.
I think there's no question that forecasting in general has been on this evolution, and I don't think that it's actually followed the evolution of how good it's gotten. If you look at the National Hurricane Center's accuracy of their track over the last 60 years, how great our forecasts have gotten. Back to Laura or Ida, where for a week in advance, the NHC's track was down to 2 miles.
I know we've talked about the cone of uncertainty where the landfall was projected. We had it in North Florida just a couple days ago.
I actually think this was one of the worst in years. I can't think of another that has moved 70 miles in 5 days.
Right, and so then it makes me think, on the topic of information, it occurred to me watching Governor Ron DeSantis, who was, very all hands on deck, very communicative with this disaster, that he's been, in the past, though, very dismissive of the concept of climate change, which is clearly causing some of these escalating disasters you've been covering. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm wondering if storms like this, if this storm, for example, is a gut check, like, are we going to rebuild in the same way and just keep living our lives in the same way? Or what do you see for that region?
See, and this is where I think it goes beyond the politics or the climate change politics or any of that. Just the intelligent thing to do is to build back with code.
What we're seeing through all this thing is the 2-story houses did as they were designed, and the water blew out through the bottom. And the 1-story houses just filled up with water, and that was pretty much it. So
you saw the buildings, and here I am for my second time in the last 4 years being in the eye wall of a Cat 4 or 5. And we're okay. So we know where it's going. And we know that if we go in this certain type of structure, we're fine. That's the type of structure everybody deserves to be in. And if we are going to rebuild, that's the only way to do it. Unfortunately, money, I think, is going to stand in the way.
The sea rise may be because of human activity and the changing climate. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But what I do know is I see the sea rising. I see the increased flooding in South Florida. So I think you'd be a fool not to consider that an issue that we need to address.
When you bring up DeSantis's history, he's got a lot of climate change adaptation going on. I mean, he's done a lot to put monies in different pockets, but it doesn't ever go to the source of how does climate change get worse, and that's by fossil fuel use. So it's kind of this strange juxtaposition of two ideas that don't really gel together. What would make a huge stance is saying, this is the way we're going, because we've felt it. And we live in one of the most susceptible states to sea level rise and climate change out of all 50. So we better lead on this. That'd be an interesting turn of events after it.
All right. Ginger Z, off of this week of just covering this devastation, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In the recent history of the Supreme Court, there have not been many years more impactful than the term that ended this past summer.
We don't care if people die!
The headliner, of course, was Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, but this term wasn't just about abortion. This court ruled that Americans have the fundamental right to carry a handgun in nearly any public area in any state. They also ruled that the EPA doesn't have the right to tell a state not to use coal power plants. And that term was not just the result of a really tricky set of cases. The reason these cases were selected and the reason they were ruled on as they were is because this court had its most conservative majority in generations, and today, those justices will begin a new term. So the question now is, what cases will this year be remembered for? Let's go to ABC senior Washington reporter Devin Dwyer, who covers the court. He will be in the room today. Devin, I said the conservative majority is not going anywhere, but there is a new justice on the bench. This is Ketanji Brown Jackson's first day hearing cases. Does she alter the makeup of this new court?
Well, as we've talked about before, Brad, she's not going to dramatically change the ideological balance on this court. It's still very much a conservative court. 6 conservative justices, 3 liberals. She replaced, remember, retiring Justice Stephen Breyer. But she will have an impact on this court in ways that I don't think we'll even begin to see until the next, 5-10 years from now.
People from all walks of life approach me with
what I can only describe as a profound sense of pride.
Of course, she's the first black woman on this bench. It's the first time there will be 4 women. Almost half the bench will be women now at the Supreme Court. That in itself is remarkable. But she brings a breadth of experience that has never been seen before as well. She's, of course, the first former public defender on this bench. That will impact the conversation in other ways. So it is a new day at the court and a new time at the court with a new dynamic behind the scenes, but they're still grappling with a lot of that fallout. You talked about it at the top from the abortion decision and guns decision last term, and that will continue to shape how they go forward.
Yeah, let's talk about the cases that are coming up before, like you said, this new court here. What are the ones people have their eyes on? Is anything going to rival kind of the immediate impact of the Dobbs decision from last year?
Well, every legal analyst I talk to, Brad, says this term has all the indications of being as much of a blockbuster as we saw last term. If last term was all about guns and abortion, this term could be defined by issues of race. There are several big cases that take on precedence in the area of race in politics and gerrymandering, redistricting, race in college admissions, and the use of race when it comes to foster care placement. The Indian Child Welfare Act from 1978, a prized piece of legislation for 40 years in Native communities, is potentially on the chopping block with this conservative court. So a lot of significant and sweeping change is on the horizon.
And it sounds like, especially in an election year, that kind of the electoral process will be before them as well.
And that's right. In addition to, these redistricting challenges already before the court, every election season we start to see emergency petitions come to the court about both the voting laws that are in place in various localities, but also, of course, the results of individual races. We could see that again. But in the wake of January 6th, Brad, and the controversy around the 2020 election still simmering, still salient, the court will hear a major case pushed by conservatives, pushed and backed by election deniers, asking this court to embrace what's known as the independent state legislature theory.
And so what this would mean if it would pass in North Carolina and many of these swing states that are controlled by the Republican legislature is that the courts would not provide a guardrail, that it would be the legislature's decision would be the final one, essentially.
In short, that would neuter the role of courts in overseeing, serving as a check on some of these challenges going forward. It would empower state legislatures in every state to have almost unbound authority to decide how, when, and where elections are administered, free from oversight of a governor, secretary of state, election board in some cases.
Oh, like the state house rules all, essentially.
A state house rules all. It's an obscure theory. Of course, its opponents say this has no basis in the Constitution. It would be a radical departure from precedent in this country, but this court has decided to take it up.
I had the honor this term of writing, I think, the only Supreme Court decision in the history of that institution that has been lambasted by a whole string of foreign leaders who felt perfectly fine commenting on American law.
Brad, this is a conservative majority, Samuel Alito among them, who are full steam ahead on their agenda of remaking this court. It's part of a long project of conservatives, as you know, and there's every indication that they're going to put their foot on the gas in the months ahead.
All right, Devin Dwyer, he will be there. He's got his seat already assigned to him today in this new era of the Supreme Court. Good luck in there, Dev.
Thank you for having me.
Next up on Start Here, the doctor who gave him a clean bill of health has been fired. So what's the prognosis for the NFL? Quick timeout, then we'll be right back. We had a full slate of football games this weekend, but the game everyone was really talking about was an NFL game this past Thursday night, which aired on Amazon Prime.
To a rolling left with the grain, and down he goes, slung down at his own 48-yard line.
That was the sound of Tua Tagovailoa, the young star quarterback from the Miami Dolphins, being swung to the ground. His head slammed down on the turf, and then it got really scary.
This was clearly from head trauma. That's it.
Somebody needs to be suspended at the minimum, possibly fired.
I have children, I have kids. After you watch that, You don't want your kid to play football.
There was nothing dirty about this play. There was no penalty called. But this incident unleashed a firestorm of criticism because there had already been questions that night about whether this quarterback should have even been playing. After all, he had suffered a similar hit just 4 days earlier.
He got up, and he damn near collapsed right back down. I'm looking at Mike McDaniels, the coach. I'm wondering, what the hell are you thinking?
In fact, before this play even happened, the leader of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, Chris Nowinski, had tweeted, quote, "If Tua has a second concussion that destroys his season or career, everyone involved will be sued and should lose their jobs," end quote. Well, we now know Tua did play, he did get injured, and guess what? One person, a doctor, has already lost a job. Let's go to that voice from the Concussion Legacy Foundation that tweeted that kind of unsettling prediction. We still don't know how much it's going to come true here, but Chris, can you just kind of walk me through what you were seeing both last Sunday and then on Thursday, because it was a kind of chain of events that made this so supercharged?
Yes. So on Sunday, Tua's head hit off the ground, and he showed 5 different signs of concussion over the next 10 seconds.
And the ball to the 28, gain of 8, and Tua, he's woozy.
He grabbed his head. Then when he stood up, he took 2 bad steps. Then he shook his head in the classic shaking off the cobwebs motion, which you only do if you can't see straight after concussion. Then he fell. And then when he got up, his teammates had to hold him up from falling again.
Tagovailoa, oh boy, getting up. Oh, my goodness. That's an awful sight to see. They will take him to the sideline.
And so I was watching it, and I said, oh, gosh, he's not going back into the game. But lo and behold, the team suddenly said he fell because he had a back injury, and he's back into the game, which shocked me. And at the time I wrote, this is absurd. He shouldn't be out there. And you never want to return a player because you can die from second impact syndrome, or you can get a second concussion that changes your life.
I kind of hit my back and kind of hurt, and then I got up, and then that's kind of like why I stumbled. My back kind of locked up on me. But for the most part, I'm good past whatever concussion protocol they had. So
he finished the game, and then I assumed the team was at least smart enough to know, okay, we probably blew the concussion evaluation. He probably did have a concussion, and to keep our story straight, we'll say his back injury is keeping him out of the Thursday night game. But that didn't happen.
Tua Tagovailoa, he will be playing in this game. There was questions about his back. He is good to go there.
The NFL was basically marketing the big Thursday night game. I mean, it was only one game. It's 2 of the top young quarterbacks in the league. And I was like, this is crazy. So that's why I tweeted, he should not go out there. This is ridiculous. It's a step back. But in the second game, his head hit off the turf even harder.
And
And what scared everybody was that Tua showed what's called decorticate posturing.
You could see both his hands, where you just get right away, you get concerned. They're bringing a stretcher out right now.
His arms came clenched against his chest. His fingers were splayed and flexed. It's just a well-known sign of a traumatic brain injury. And it's not even something common in concussions, but it's common in traumatic brain injury. And so when Tua was carted off the field, it was just worst-case scenario. And you literally, for a while, didn't know what would happen next, because a few athletes a year die from second impact syndrome with 2 big hits in a short period of time. And so I just, waited with bated breath to see what would happen. Luckily, he survived. But now the question is, what's next for Tua?
Well, yeah, and after the game, the Dolphins said he was conscious, that he could move his extremities, and that he was flying home. People had more than paralysis on their minds, though. And Tua Tagovailoa put out the statement in recent days that said he was feeling much better, didn't really describe his diagnosis. And can you talk about this, that the NFL has had new protocols in recent years, right, Chris? They call them these, concussion protocols. They're well known. What is supposed to happen when an NFL player gets hit hard in the head?
So the protocol as exists today exists because so many mistakes have been made in the past, and you can almost trace moments back of why these things are in place. So there's a team doctor, and they're in charge of whether or not that person returns. But the NFL Players Association advocated for what's called an unaffiliated neurotrauma consultant, so a separate doctor not paid by the team, to also participate in the evaluation and make a recommendation, because the players do not trust the team doctors. Even the most ethical doctor, when they're being paid by the club or their reputation is staked by their retention with the club, they can be influenced in their medical decisions. That's just a fact of human beings.
Oh, look at him. Look at him. Now that hurts. Anytime you get the hand shaking and stuff.
5 years ago, a player named Tom Savage was returned to the game after he showed something similar to what Tua showed called the fencing posture, where he was unconscious and he had another brainstem incident where his arm stuck out straight in front of him. Right. So when he showed that and was returned, the NFL within 10 days said, oh my gosh, new policy. If you show that posture, you can't go back in. And we're going to require the doctor to review the tape. You can observe a concussion on video and make a diagnosis.
So to clarify, did you hit the back of your head when you fell down on that play?
Yeah, I did. But I think I really hit my back first because that's what I felt first. So.
The doctor for the Dolphins had to review the tape. The biggest mistake is in the execution of the protocol. What the NFL is not telling you is that protocol is not strong. The 15-minute evaluation they do in the locker room is imperfect. We all know it's imperfect. There's no objective test for concussion. And the brain has a magical ability to right itself after a big brain trauma. We've all seen people who've been knocked unconscious, pop up, and you test them and they're fine. They just happen to be the kind of person who can pass a protocol quickly after concussion. So the NFL for the last 15 years has been trying to minimize the role of on-field signs of a concussion so that they would retain flexibility in returning someone to play if they seem cognitively sound enough in the locker room to go back into the game. And this is where it bit them in the butt.
Well, and this unaffiliated doctor who is on site that, they're approved by both the Players Union and the league.
Yes.
The Players Association fired this doctor over the weekend. They said they're investigating the process over the last week. Tua is going to be interviewed as part of that process. But is all that an admission that Tua, in fact, did have a concussion going into Thursday? Like, what is that supposed to signal?
Yeah, I mean, I believe by the letter of the law, it's not necessarily an admission that he made a mistake. But I think we can all read between the lines here that something must have gone wrong if that doctor did not think that Tua should be held out.
I don't think that an injury from last week made him fall the same way this week, But yeah, I do not have any, absolutely zero patience for or will ever put a player in a position for them to be in harm's way.
So when I played football at Harvard in the late 90s, we diagnosed concussions, but I think our expectation was you might miss a couple days. And then in 2003, while I was wrestling for the WWE, I had 2 concussions in a short period of time, neither of which I really appreciated was a concussion, so I never reported the symptoms. And it gave me permanent post-concussion syndrome. I'm still not the same person I was 19 years ago. I had a 15-year headache and all sorts of other problems. So I certainly am concerned that Tua might have to go through what I went through, which was career ending. I could not exercise for a decade without feeling nauseous. So that's the only reason I actually got involved in researching concussions and CTE, went back to school and got my PhD in behavioral neuroscience, is because I couldn't escape this issue, and I wanted to make it better for athletes going forward. And so we have made it better. We're the reason why there are protocols, but we're still playing games with people's brains. And we all now have to be aware of what's happening to NFL players 10, 20, 30 years down the line. We might look back on this moment and say, oh, that's the moment that everything started going bad. And I don't wish that on Tua, but that's just the reality that we live in now.
We know the league and the union have been meeting about new guidelines. Sources tell our partners at ESPN they will likely create a new rule saying if a player shows instability at any time, pretty wide definition there, he is not allowed back in the game. End of story. And I know you've already come out and said, well, that might mean if a player goes down, they might stay down longer just so no one sees them stumble so they can come back in and play later. We'll see what happens. Chris Nowinski, the CEO of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, thank you so much for the time and perspective.
Thank you.
All right, one more quick break. When we return, it's a hobby for some, but when money's involved, fishing gets real serious. One Last Thing is next. And one last thing. We've seen some bizarre cheating scandals in recent months, but this is by far the fishiest.
You over a lot of people, man. They've been doing this for years. Cheating.
That is video from the conclusion of a big fishing tournament that ended Friday on Lake Erie. Competitors are showing off their final catches. Heaviest catch gets the big prize. Except right after these guys are announced the winners, the tournament organizer starts cutting into their fish and discovers lead weights. It's tough to hear between the bleeps, but the organizer, Jason Fisher, yes, that is his real name, dramatically holds up a lead weight and, like an umpire, tells him, "You're out of here." The other anglers are way less polite.
I mean, we all knew it. What the man? Yeah, they've been doing this whole
In fact, it got so heated that Fisher had to tell people not to be baited into attacking the alleged cheaters. When asked what made him suspicious in the first place, he said, "You can generally tell on sight how heavy a fish is, and the ones these guys were showing off, even though they were lumpy, should have only been about 4 pounds each. So how were 5 of them clocking in at over 30 pounds?
We've just heard from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources that they responded to the tournament on Friday. They say they've collected evidence and are now preparing a report for the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office.
There's actually a long tradition of cheating in angling competitions. For example, you can fish in areas that aren't supposed to be fished. You can bring along a cage full of pre-caught fish and, ta-da, show up at the docks with a great haul. Some competitors even stuff their catch with ice right before weigh-in, making everything just a little bit heavier. And hey, if anyone tries to check, all they'll find is water. Because of this history, past winners, including these men who have now been stripped to their title, had been subjected to polygraph tests and had a supervisor on their boat. Apparently, that still didn't stop them. The 2 anglers haven't spoken publicly since, and it's unclear what could happen to their prior earnings. After pulling weight after weight out of these fish, Fisher, the tournament director, was inconsolable. On Facebook, he apologized to fellow fishing enthusiasts for letting them down. Fans said, "Don't worry, Jason, they'll be back next year," and thanked him for at least tackling the problem. Talk about a video that will hook you. It's like mesmerizing to see this dramatic moment. More on all these stories at abcnews.com or the ABC News app. I'm Brad Milkey. See you tomorrow.